Greatness. Should American presidents really aspire to it? Today, we're going to talk with Amity Shlaes, co-editor of the new edition of the autobiography of Calvin Coolidge and the board chair of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, who recently argued in an op-ed that no, presidents shouldn't aspire to greatness for their own good and the nation's good. Why? We're going to talk with Amity Shlaes today about that exact question here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. I am Jimmy Sengenberger, and we're getting started right now.
Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix, I said. Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
Hello, my friends, and welcome to another edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner, and it is such a pleasure and a privilege to be with you today, as it is always. Please, if you like our content, share it and like this video. Also, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads, as well as the Jimmy at the Crossroads podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts, whichever is your chosen podcast provider. And of course, follow our friends regularly at the Washington Examiner at washingtonexaminer.com. Folks, it is such a pleasure to be with you as always, especially when we talk about issues from a fascinating perspective. I mean, look, we just went through 4 years of President Donald Trump, who really liked to talk about the greatness of his presidency, and also, of course, making America great again. In his inauguration speech, Joe Biden also echoed the idea of great, saying it several times in his address. But should American presidents aspire to be great? My guest today says no. In fact, for the good of the country, they shouldn't be aspiring to be great. Amity Shlaes is co-editor of the autobiography of Calvin Coolidge, which is published by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. It's out in a new edition, and she also chairs the board of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, is the author of 6 other books. Amity, welcome to the program. It's so good to have you.
Glad to be here.
Thank you so much. I mean, it is always, first of all, you always give a unique perspective because you're talking frequently about a president that most Americans don't really know much about. I think he is the most underrated president in American history, yet he is one of the greatest presidents in American history. And before we get to the idea of greatness of a president and a presidency, I'd love for you to just talk to us a little bit about why you felt such a passion for making sure that the American people know about the life and legacy of Calvin Coolidge.
Well, I think you're right, Jimmy. Coolidge is underrated. If Coolidge were a stock, he'd be a buy. So he's the president who served in the 20s after Warren Harding, before Herbert Hoover, and the history books don't treat him that well. They kind of treat him as a footnote or place warmer among the Roosevelts. But actually, Coolidge is the most relevant president for us. Why? Because he enabled a growth economy by getting out of the way. What do I mean specifically? He actually cut the federal budget, didn't merely reduce the increase, but actually cut the federal budget so that it was lower when he left office after 67 months than when he came in. He also halved taxes, so that's important too. He took the top tax rate down to 25%. That's lower even than Ronald Reagan. So who was this guy? And the growth that resulted was stupendous. People got cars for the first time. Remember the Model A? People got washing machines, and people got Saturday off. Little known fact, a lot of people worked Saturdays, a 6-day week, up until the 20s. So what's not to like? There he is, Silent Cal. You can tell a lot about him because he's very useful.
Yeah, when you talk about Silent Cal, I mean, that's, of course, the nickname that he was known more for his personality and persona, but also you think about the way in which he approached governing really was this idea of let's have more of a hands off strategy to governing as opposed to what we're seeing today, which is everybody seems to be looking for the government to step in and save people.
Well, that's right. I mean, sometimes you think someone who doesn't do anything is weak, but sometimes it takes more strength not to intervene. If you think of the sport of windsurfing, it looks so easy to just stand there with that sail, but if you've ever windsurfed, to stay upright in a big wind and move forward takes incredible core strength. If Coolidge were an athlete, he'd be a windsurfer. What he did looked easy, but was really hard because everyone was always pushing him to intervene. There were progressives in that period as well. And he said, no, it's better for the president to refrain and let the economy be great. It's really not a question of nobody being great. It's what is great about the United States, and the economy is great if you give it parameters in which it can operate and grow. He did that.
As we're talking about Coolidge and also greatness, let's define the idea of what makes America great from Coolidge's perspective, Amity Shlaes.
Well, Coolidge said, he didn't say what makes America great. He also spoke incrementally. He would have, let's just aim for a good economy and see if we can get that and then go farther. Don't over promise and under deliver. He said under promise, Coolidge did, and over deliver. So what he focused on was the economy. He said the chief business of the American people is business. He had a corollary to that. The chief ideal of the American people is idealism. That is, he placed a lot of faith on the individual and the private sector. He knew that a lot of, our flourishing comes from that and less probably from government, even in a crisis.
What's so fascinating, too, when we talk about the idea of the role of government is that we're talking in the 1920s, before FDR's New Deal, for example. And now we've gotten to a point where the American government is massively bigger than it ever was in Coolidge's, probably his wildest imaginations, although maybe not. You can certainly tell me what he envisioned as the possible maximum growth point of the federal government if he ever contemplated such things. But nowadays, I wonder, and certainly it's a real challenge for conservatives and libertarians to make the case for why we need to not have government intervention in so many aspects of our lives, scale back the size, scope, role, and involvement of government. How do you think we can learn the lessons from his fight against the idea of government stepping in and intervening today when we seem to be so far gone?
Well, usually when Congress is incapable of change, as now, Congress isn't going to have the budget. Something intervenes, an event that forces Congress to do that, right? So one day, the currency will get in trouble, or we'll have inflation, or something will unfortunately wake us up. That's always been the way it was. Think about Ronald Reagan. He never would have been elected in 1968. But he was elected in 1980. We passed through this purgatory called the 1970s, unfortunately, and only then did we see the merits of the smaller government Goldwater Reagan argument of 1980. Or the United Kingdom, you think of Mrs. Thatcher. She never would have been PM had England not been through some trouble when the world told England its economic policy was worse than subpar. So sometimes you have to go through an experience to know you need a strong leader, a different kind of leader. I just hope we don't in the United States. I think it's, right now we are in a crisis, even though everything feels all right. The stock market goes up because Americans no longer trust themselves. The government has to tell them everything, and you have to pay, look at the moral cost. Here we are in New York. We have to have a COVID vaccine passport, but we can't get a COVID vaccine. What kind of damage does that do to individual souls when you give them impossible laws and say, well, you have to obey these laws or you're in trouble or worse? We're already in a spiritual crisis in the United States because the autonomy of the individual has been so reduced.
That is such a profoundly important point, I think. Again, we're talking with Amity Shlaes, who is co-editor of the newly released new edition of the autobiography of Calvin Coolidge and heads up the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. You wrote a piece recently along with Matthew Denhart, also of the foundation, entitled "Presidents Should Avoid Great for Their Own Good and the Nation's." I want to get to some specific examples that you talk about in your piece, but overall, what's the key premise of your article?
Well, the key premise is vanity. Vanity is a problem because a vain president squanders political capital, right? So there was a crisis in the Republican Party in the early 20s, similar to January 6th, which is, well, the party didn't know what it was doing. It didn't know if some of its friends, acquaintances had done should be disavowed, to what extent. That crisis was Teapot Dome. Republicans didn't like Republicans. So President Harding died and a new president came in and he said, well, if people broke the law, that was wrong. We're going to investigate that. But meantime, we're going to clean up the presidency. And by doing that, we will clean up the nation and heal after trouble. And what can I do as the new president, Calvin Coolidge? I can focus on service and not my own vanity. So he said, look, I'm not here because I'm a great leader. I'm here to burnish not myself, but the presidency. So real humility, which is very valuable after a crisis. There's a story about Calvin Coolidge. He was walking along in front of the White House with a senator, and the senator is trying to make Coolidge happier. Coolidge was kind of a grumpy guy. And he said, what lucky fellow gets to live in that house with the pretty white pillars? And Coolidge said, nobody does. They just come and go. We're all servants of God, of the nation, right? Of the people. Nobody does. Nobody really lives there. Political leaders come and go. And because he gave so much up to service and so little to himself or his family, Coolidge was able to achieve legislatively a tremendous amount. He was able to get that tax cut through. He was able to veto popular laws that involve spending, such as laws for what would become the Tennessee Valley Authority or farm subsidy. Because he gave up himself in service, people understood that he was serious. His life was consistent. He didn't squander capital, and he asked Americans not to squander capital or pennies, right? And that was extremely valuable. That's not everyone's style, but the essential problem with greatness is when you say, I want the country to be great, what it ends up being is about you being great. There's a slippage over to the leader. And you know what? Strong leaders are only part of our country. The main part of our country is strong institutions.
And that is a critical point we'll get to in a moment with you, Amity, when we talk about America's institutions. But I do want to address a couple of presidents who are known as great or who thought that it was their responsibility to achieve some kind of greatness in one way or the other. And one that you talk about in the piece is, and it's so, I think, apropos here, and that is Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, and his Great Society of the 1960s, especially, for example, the War on Poverty, one of the key planks of his Great Society. Talk to us about your thoughts on LBJ and this question of greatness.
Well, LBJ was a loving man. He was also a huge ego, and he didn't like the idea of a good society. He wanted a great society because he wanted to be a great leader. And so he set some goals with the Great Society program, which he unveiled in 1964 at the University of Michigan at a famous speech commencement, and then spoke around about in that period. One was to cure poverty, C-U-R-E, cure. He didn't say reduce poverty somewhat. He wanted better reading and math for American kids, including by standardized measures. And he said, let's end racial division. Well, Johnson didn't cure poverty. He in fact, the rate of poverty abatement decelerated subsequent to the Great Society programs. Well, today, reading and math scores are not where they might have been after a few hundreds, well, anyway, trillions of spending, and racial division still appears to be still with us. In fact, I would argue it's worse. And that's so Johnson's big goals, which involved essentially, after a couple of years, affirmative action, and affirmative action like program spending for groups only created groups that wanted more. Because whether you're white or black, if you're given something as a group, first class ticket to your COVID vaccine, you're going to be a fool not to take it, right? And you're going to be panicked about maybe there won't be a ticket tomorrow for a COVID vaccine, so I'm going to run and get it. That's the way groups responded to Johnson's expanding welfare state. There's a ticket for me, I better take it. I'd be a fool if I didn't. Rather, what Johnson could have done was appeal to the dignity of men and women and say those who work hard in America will be sure they're really rewarded with lower taxes, with fewer programs, removing perverse programs. He didn't do that. So by the time Johnson left, and he didn't run again, which he could have, he was really demoralized, as I describe in my book, Great Society. He was talking austerity, not great at all. That's an example of over-promising and under-delivering. The only thing Johnson delivered that really, that he was really super at, or the main thing, was laws. It was said Johnson signed so many laws that he made laws the way other men ate chocolate chip cookies. But his Great Society was disappointing. And how do we know that? We know that because President Biden did not hang a picture of Lyndon Johnson behind himself. He hung Franklin Roosevelt, another great who's so far away no one can remember the results of the New Deal, President Roosevelt's Great Society. But if you examine those, as I do with the data in the book Forgotten Man, you'll see that the New Deal didn't work out too well either.
Yeah, and I'll get to FDR in just a moment, but in terms of LBJ, that key plank of the war on poverty and curing poverty has been an abject failure, because while in the first, I think, 4 or 5 years of that war on poverty, you saw a decrease, ever since then, we have been fairly pat and consistent and too high when it comes to poverty, showing that, no, absolutely, it was a failure.
And I want to recommend a book by John Cogan, The High Cost of Good Intentions of the Hoover Institute. He spends an entire book quantifying this. And his hypothesis, which is borne out by the evidence, is that rather than cure poverty, we institutionalized it.
I think that is well put. Now, let's talk about FDR, especially because we've heard a lot of references in the last couple of years from Democrats. I mean, in fact, a big plank of the left is the Green New Deal, a direct reference to FDR's New Deal, which at least theoretically was his attempt to combat the Great Depression. How about FDR and his approach to greatness?
Well, again, there is a problem with the ego. What do I mean? It's not just because I disapprove of big egos, or we would. It's because an ego person tends to make it about himself and therefore squanders political capital. FDR said, well, this election is about me in 1936. And he spoke of the need for bold, persistent experimentation. That would be by me, the president, right? And markets don't like unpredictable experimentation. So the stock market froze. The stock market didn't come back to the 29 level from 1929 until Roosevelt was long gone. So we had a much tougher depression, the evidence suggests, and we need have had Roosevelt been more restrained. I think the problem is this. A lot of us admire Roosevelt's leadership in World War II, where he is commander-in-chief. American presidents have different roles, and when they're dealing with foreign policy in a war, they are in charge. They're the dictator because they're commander-in-chief. When they're at home, they're just 1/3 of the government, chief executive, a far weaker role. So if you like FDR in the war as commander-in-chief, you tend to slip into saying he was a great commander-in-chief at home. He was a bad leader at home precisely because he acted like a domestic commander-in-chief. Presidents have personalities. Roosevelt was better and talents. He was a good Navy president. He was not a great economic president. He didn't really get econ, and he suspected it. And so he switched back and forth on policies. Gerald Ford, by the way, did the same thing. So there was a total mishmash in policy. An example would be the minimum wage of the period. There was a consistent upward pressure on wages in the Great Depression, whether from Herbert Hoover and then from Roosevelt. Well, that was a bad idea. Why? Common sense. If employers can't really afford to employ as much as they used to because their profits are lower, because the depression is on, and you insist they raise the wages, what do? They hire the most experienced people, but fewer of them, creating structural unemployment. And that's what you see. That's the great tragedy of the Great Depression, that 1 in 10 was unemployed, and for a rather long time, because of this perverse government-driven upward pressure on wages.
Again, we're talking with Amity Shlaes, who chairs the board of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation and is co-editor of the new edition of the autobiography of Calvin Coolidge. In terms of FDR, people really do look back at him and say, oftentimes, he saved America from the Great Depression and that he is one of America's greatest presidents. But I think what you're doing, and I've enjoyed conversations in the past of actually adding nuance to the presidency of FDR, because people often just paint a broad brush and say he was great in World War II and he must be great in the Great Depression, but there truly is more than meets the eye there. So in terms of this question of greatness, what lessons do you think we should learn from FDR and his presidency?
Well, in the case of FDR, his great leadership, and he's a man who was elected 1, 2, 3, 4 times. He was very popular because he gave out money, and he was, as I said, a first-class temperament. He was very lovable, personally admirable due to his impairments. But his economic policy just didn't work. And after a while, the people get that. I mean, you can look at a pullback even under Truman, who is a fellow Democrat, and certainly under Ike, and certainly since then, some of those FDR laws did not stand. One would be the Great Wagner Act. It was a tiger labor law, which we neutered into a little pussycat labor law with a law called Taft-Hartley. So a lot, you don't hear about the New Deal until recently, and that's because no one who remembered the New Deal really wanted to repeat it. They knew that it didn't work out. So we had to come all this distance in time to be able to deceive ourselves that the New Deal was so awesome. Nothing is new. It's just forgotten, especially the errors of the New Deal or the Great Society. I do have a new book out, Great Society. That's an ironic title because unfortunately the Great Society wasn't so great. It's not a hostile book. I just described the painful efforts of people who meant well and didn't get what they sought, notwithstanding their good intentions. That's often the story with government folly.
Absolutely. And they say the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and rarely have truer words been spoken. Amity, just a few minutes left with you, and I want to bring you to our present moment. We just had 4 years, the presidency of Donald Trump, whose central plank was let's make America great again. He also likes to tout his achievements and his accomplishments and what he has brought to the table. And now you've got Joe Biden as president of the United States, and he has his own sort of ambition slate and approach to this idea of greatness. In fact, both of them included the word great several times in their inaugural addresses. Talk to me about Donald Trump and Joe Biden.
Well, I think the picture when you talk about either of them it has been played out for us in real time very well. Long story short, which is better at providing even in a crisis? Surprisingly often, it's the private sector. Example from recent life. It is not the FDA that made the vaccines. It is private companies. To be sure, they were aided by government. Here's an example of something our government did that was on balance likely good. We got the vaccine out faster than some scientists said we could. Where did the vaccine come from? Mostly the private sector, with some aid and some good policy from government, some questionable policy, but mostly from the private sector. Who is in charge of distribution? Well, the government or the state governments. Was the distribution optimal? Not yet. We're telling people they have to have vaccine passports while it's still hard for them to get vaccines. That's a terrible civic message. So we saw that the private sector did a better job in an emergency than the public sector. It's not an absolute, something we need government, but generally American greatness comes from the private sector. That's the lesson of the past year and a half.
Yeah, I think it's so true. And you look at the way in which I actually, it really is a strong example in terms of the vaccine. I think the biggest way that the federal government helped to bring about these vaccines much more quickly than almost anyone anticipated is because it got out of the way and removed barriers to development, though, Amity.
That's right. Well, that's very Coolidge-esque, that there.
Gotta love it. All right, Amity Shlaes, author of several books, including Great Society, and co-editor of the autobiography of Calvin Coolidge in its new edition. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your insights.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Once again, Amity Shlaes, board chair of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. And gosh, she had so many important insights to offer in that conversation. I mean, the legacy of Calvin Coolidge is vastly underrated. It is undertaught in schools, and he is someone who we should be looking to much more for guidance. We didn't really get to the topic yet of America's institutions. Calvin Coolidge, as Amity Shlaes writes, Calvin Coolidge believed in the greatness of America's institutions and its founding principles, not in the greatness of government programs or of the ability for the federal government to amass resources to address people's problems. That isn't remotely what Coolidge believed, and Coolidge's philosophy, I think, has been vindicated time and time again. And we've had a president of the United States in Donald Trump, and now with Joe Biden, who really aspire to be great, to do great things. I think the reason why Joe Biden put the picture of FDR behind him is because Biden fancies himself a sort of second coming of Roosevelt, or at least that's what he wants to be remembered as. That's not the way that any president should be remembered, but alas, it's what he would like to see. And Joe Biden, now as president of the United States, certainly has an agenda that he wants to achieve and a legacy that he wants to leave. And so naturally, he is going to try and leave his mark like that. Nevertheless, the central point of Amity Shlaes is that we should not simply be looking for presidents to aspire to greatness. Indeed, presidents should not inspire to greatness is a very important admonition. And I hope you found some insights from that conversation. I sure did. Well, that is it for us today here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. My thanks to the Washington Examiner for their partnership as always, to Amity Shlaes for joining us and sharing her tremendous insights on today's program, and of course, a very special thanks to you for liking, subscribing, and sharing all of our content. We do appreciate your support. That is it for us today. We'll be back real soon with more content here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. In the meantime, have a great day. And as always, may God bless America.
Talking politics, great for generations. Oh, what mix. I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.
Awesome.
Boom.